Everybody, you're very, very welcome this afternoon. A really huge turnout today for our webinar on aligning HR strategy to business strategy for 2021. First of all, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for taking the time today. It's great to see so many of you tuned in, which is a real testament to the importance and timeliness, I think, of this webinar and the subject matter and the work required now for HR to prepare businesses for 2021. It's been a few months actually since we've been talking to you. I know we did a video update for you in December, but I think it was September when we met last and caught up with you. But in the meantime, it's been an interesting few months for us gathering insights from you and your management teams through our regional colleagues and from among our tourism recovery task forces, and again by our executive with the industry advisory group. And I think we can clearly confirm that 2020 will definitely go down in history as the most disrupted, turbulent year ever in tourism and hospitality to date, fraught with challenges and requiring a lot of us to operate in a very largely, reactive way, I think it's fair to say, from adapting to new operating guidelines, addressing COVID safety and other retraining requirements with staff, the challenge for staff communications and communication channels as some staff were laid off and others were remote working from home, and all this, of course, while they were juggling homeschooling and in some cases care responsibilities and commitments as well as the ongoing changes in employment and wage supports that you were all grappling with, and the stop-start nature of the season and attempts to drive the season extension, and of course the abrupt short cut to the Christmas and New Year efforts to drive revenue. We could go on, but today is not about that. While none of us really would have wished that we'd be sitting here at level 5 restrictions today as we approach what is traditionally recognised as the opening of the tourism season with St. Patrick's weekend coming up, it's hard to believe it'll be the first anniversary of the COVID restrictions on our industry. But it's clear we have to adopt a much more planned approach to HR this year. After all, I think it's important that we reflect on the things that we know now that we really didn't know in 2020. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight a few. We now have a vaccine, and by God, are we all grasping to that light at the end of the tunnel. And we have a vaccine rollout plan. We have clarity on retention of employment supports, at least until June. Our children have a return to education programme, and our Leaving Cert students and children also have clarity too. And for the wider workforce industry sectors, we soon will see a staggered return to work plan as the industry are preparing for this. But there's many and much needed to be done and to be mindful of as we prepare for that. We're more familiar now with the expectations of customer safety and risks for COVID spread. Our staff have learned new ways of working with COVID. We have a commitment from government that when we reopen, they will do their utmost to ensure businesses stay open. We've also seen consumer behaviour changes. We know, for example, that there's more demand now for food experiences, eating outdoors, food to go, click and collect, all things that mean changes in structures likely and staffing resource requirements for you. We also know that there's a growing demand for in-room dining as well, again, which may see change requirements at an operations level. We know that we will have restricted indoor numbers for the foreseeable future for events, and this has implications, of course, for all of you for weddings, conferences and meeting staffing for the rest of 2021. We will also see more locals and day visitors to our businesses who will be seeking a much more engaged, outdoor-focused experience and activities. And we need to ensure we're pivoting our staffing levels for that too. We also have a new culture now of home working, and this will bring us new customer segments and audiences, as many of us who would have been commuter employees in the past now actually have got to know our local community and the services much better. But equally, it will offer HR and business management teams the opportunity and also the challenge to consider a hybrid of home working and office-based workforces from now on, as government are preparing legislation on this pending in September. We've also seen most of our sales move to digital channels. And if this is a factor that's likely to remain and which is requiring much more investment in in-house digital resources and skills, which again will be demanding on HR in workforce planning. We've seen a growth in customer familiarity and confidence with touchless technology. In fact, we have, believe it or not, fast forwarded 8 years in technology development within the last 8 months. And the expectation is that consumer behaviour will be maintained like this. So therefore, we will see expectation by consumers for things like remote check-in, keyless entry, QR code menus, self-service ordering online, not just from home, but equally possibly at the table in your dining room. All are emerging new norms that not only are desirable, but will be expected by consumers. And this has implications for staffing, but equally for training. We've also seen some of the best of our talent leave to competitor industries. You've been telling us about this now since early New Year. And some of these have left to areas like essential retail and online retail. Some would say this has happened because there's greater certainty in those industries, but some of us, like me, would argue that maybe it's because these industries have been ahead of us in terms of the way in which they've been developing and presenting their career progression path opportunities and presenting their staff benefit packages and the flexibility of working hours when they are recruiting new staff. So all of a sudden, these industries may be challenging us in terms of their appeal for some of our well-trained, customer-focused workforce. So all things considered, there's a lot we know now that we didn't know last year. And all of this has implications for HR strategy, for skills development, for recruitment planning, for career development opportunities, as well as retention strategies too, and tactics, not to mention the area of staff communications. So in light of this, we really see 2021 as the year we need to regain control of the flight path we're on for the industry we're in, as a people-orientated service industry, and how we do this with a new HR strategy that is aligned to business strategy, which we're going to hear about now today. So to kick off today, I'm delighted to be joined again by Caroline McEnery, HR and employment law expert and former member of the Low Pay Commission, as well as being an active adjudication officer in the Workplace Relations Commission. For those joining today for the first time, Caroline comes to us with over 20 years industry experience in areas from retail, food production and hospitality. And Caroline has spent the last months and year really working extensively across various industries, sectors in helping them pause and take stock and develop a clear strategy now to align to their new business strategy in 2021. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and maybe some things we can learn from other industries as well. But before I hand over to Caroline, Colette, I think we might kick off with the first poll question today, if you don't mind. So to kick off, we just ask you maybe to consider what you believe to be the biggest challenges you're facing right now. And you can have the choice there to select a number of the options we've given you there. And while we're taking, I suppose, answers on that question, Caroline, maybe you might tell us from your perspective and working across other industries, what are you seeing and what do you believe are the biggest challenges?
I think a lot of people are waiting to get certainty, Amanda, in relation to an opening date, etc. So a lot of people are not doing anything as a result. And I think the biggest challenge is needing to have a really good plan put in place now, which hopefully today will help people who have already started that plan and maybe flesh it out a lot more. But I think it's really important that we're planning and we're making the plan a reality. And when the date comes, that just falls in to be part of the plan. But I think there's lots we can be doing in advance of that to prepare for reopening and prepare for the next steps. So I think it's that uncertainty around what's happening is nearly causing people to be maybe a little bit unsure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Caroline. I think, there is an awful lot which I know we're going to talk about now today that is irrelevant. It needs to be done regardless of when we get the notification of an opening date. So Colette, we might take actually the results of that poll now, if you don't mind. Thank you. Okay, so we can see there, we can just see there's quite a selection of issues, but I suppose the dominant one being staff retention and then staff well-being. So, I suppose fairly balanced concern right across the areas that we've spoken about there, Caroline. So maybe something you want to pick up on over the course of this afternoon. So with that, without further ado, Caroline, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Amanda. And I suppose we've a fairly comprehensive agenda today that I think is going to touch on all of those key points that have been raised in the poll. So we've tried to make this morning's session as comprehensive as we can to give you lots of food for thought to help you put together your HR strategy for the year ahead. So we're going to look at what does your business strategy require so that we can align our HR strategy to it. We're going to look at what are the big ticket items and the key priorities to consider. We're going to look at some internal pillars to help you do a HR diagnostic, and then we're going to look at elements of your people strategy. So I suppose to start with, obviously a lot of you now will have a very clear business strategy at this stage in place and will have done a lot of work in identifying what is the strategic direction that your organisation is going to take in light of the COVID backdrop, and what does that look like for 2021 and beyond. And ultimately, I suppose that will definitely cascade down and have implications for your HR strategy, which we're going to look at. I suppose 6 key areas of your business strategy that are really important for you to consider. And ultimately for me, the more of your people that you involve in this process, the better. Obviously, we're going to look at what is our vision and what are our business objectives. Amanda mentioned there about at-home dining, outside dining, etc., technology. There's so many new opportunities of what that might look like in terms of those business objectives. I suppose culture and those core values is what keeps people connected and what is one of the key ingredients that means we join the organisation and we stay because of the core values, because we remember people will often forget what you said, but they won't forget how you made them feel. So the core values within the organisation, what are they? Are we living them? Are we demonstrating them? Can we do more to bring them to life, particularly at these times? And things like, for example, doing your monthly update for staff, whether they're working with you or whether they're on layoff, the importance of keeping them connected and reminding them of your business values, your business objectives, etc., is really important for that. Obviously, doing a SWOT analysis for the next year and doing it for beyond the next year. Amanda has given you lots of insights, for example, in relation to opportunities, areas for development, threats, strengths, etc. And again, doing that with as many of your team as you can will really get people on board, and doing it individually then for individual departments also. That's going to in turn help us identify what tactics and what plans we need to put in place. And to complement those plans, we need to look at what resource allocations and what skills, etc., we may need. And the most important thing of any business strategy is we set SMART goals that are specific and measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, and then that they can be measured. So what KPIs are we going to put in place, or key performance indicators, to facilitate us to look back and say, have we measured them? So in relation to reopening, which is one of these business objectives you're going to be considering, these are some of the questions that you might look at. And there's lots more as you engage with your team that you're going to identify as well. So things like, when are you hoping to open? Obviously restriction dependent. What is your planned business model going to look like? So for example, that might be different in relation to how you now do breakfast. It might be different in relation to how you manage children's activities, etc. So what does that look like? What does each department's operating model look like? And now start putting in place your SOPs or your standard operating procedures so that you have clarity. How does this impact your people strategy, which is what we're going to be focusing a lot on today? So for example, we might need to upskill staff in relation to the use of new technology. We know we definitely have to update staff in relation to new ways of working, in relation to COVID, in relation to best practice, etc. And what else do we need to consider in relation to reopening? Obviously, we've got to do the training in relation to the government return to work protocol. So again, start your brainstorming session now in relation to what do we need to consider for the overall business and what do we need to consider then for individual departments. So we have a really good plan as to what that might look like. So when we consider those types of strategic decisions, they might include some of the following. For example, it might involve more cross-selling, more innovation in terms of product or service. We might be looking to grow sales from new services or new experiences. We might be looking to improve customer service to drive a new culture, expanding our offering, service differentiation, revised pricing and packaging, and technology improvements, improvement in terms of customer retention, and increased focus on sustainability. So they're all just some examples. But again, the more you engage with your team, the more you're going to identify what's right for you. So once we do that, I suppose there's 4 key strands to our people strategy in terms of what that might look like. And the first is define what the future looks like. So what do we need in terms of capability, leadership, culture, skills, know-how, practices, systems, procedures, etc. After that, let's look and see how we're going to drive performance. So that might be through our HR processes like training. It might be increased communication, technology, metrics, etc. So again, how are we going to manage that? Obviously, upskilling our managers to performance manage people in this new environment is going to be really important. Training staff is going to be really important. I suppose once we determine the strategy, it's likely you're going to have gaps, for example, in terms of your recruitment piece. So attracting, sourcing, rewarding, engaging, and growing that team. And for a lot of businesses, a recruitment strategy is a very important part of that. And when you're aligning what is your business strategy and your vision, we also obviously need to take into account what's the backdrop in relation to the environment in relation to that. And one example Amanda gave you is in relation to skills, potentially moving from the hospitality industry into other industries, and how do we ensure we retain that skill and talent and attract also as we need to fill new vacancies going forward. So what are your big ticket items that we need to focus on? And some of those might include some of the following. And these are projects that are big ticket items that deserve a specific project plan and a timeline to make sure that while we have the chance now, we're getting all these key projects done. So we mentioned the reopening piece, which is focusing on rehiring and onboarding and hiring new staff as well. And that onboarding piece, we don't want to underestimate. People have been out for quite a long period of time, and getting them back into best practice and, getting them back into the routine of work, the high standard of customer service, etc., needs to be a transition to ensure that, we get staff back to the standard that they were at prior to going, or even to a higher standard. What do we need to do in relation to our HR policies, in terms of legal compliance, etc.? So again, you will all be familiar with the new policies associated with COVID, for example, and making sure that they're signed off. Same with the return to work protocol, etc. So again, revisit those. What are we doing in terms of supporting performance and management of same, including improving staff morale? Because a lot of people are, finding that, especially now that uncertainty is a real challenge. So communication and enhancement is really important to ensure that we keep staff connected with the organisation. Do we need to develop a new competency framework? Really important to be clear as we now recruit and as we upskill and retrain people as we onboard them back to the business, that competency framework is up to date and relevant and live for your business. And remember, your competency framework should run right throughout your organisation. So it should reflect your core values, it should reflect the mindset, the skills, the attitude that you require from both the overall organisation and also from individual roles. This competency framework in turn helps you with attraction, with recruitment, with performance management, and with promotional opportunities and career path planning, which is a really important part of ensuring we retain the best skill. Supporting employees' well-being is something that came up in the poll and is something that we've been actively advocating right throughout the entire COVID year that we've had. And that can't be underestimated, making sure that we're, again, engaging with our employees. And oftentimes when you have different activities, it's the people who don't engage and should engage the most that don't. So reaching out to those employees is really important. Have we a succession plan in place? Do we know who's going to return, who's committed to returning, and have we a plan in place for those that aren't? How are we going to support organisational growth? And again, embedding the brand and the culture throughout the organisation. How are we going to manage to do that? So these are 5 pillars that we would normally look at in terms of trying to assess elements of what your HR strategy should include. And they include risk and compliance, where obviously the foundations of any HR strategy needs to manage risk and compliance. Then you look at performance management and developing your people. Then we look at training. Then we look at change management, and then we look at the whole recruitment piece in relation to retention, employer branding, culture, etc. So this is just a framework to assist you in thinking about, have you all the key areas covered off in your HR strategy? So when we look at risk and compliance, here are some ideas of what we might look at. So you're going to look at your contracts, make sure that they're up to date, make sure that you've got the relevant clauses in place. And we've learned a lot during COVID about the fact that you really need to make sure that you have a really good contract and a really good staff handbook. Many organisations who didn't proactively prepare and spend time and effort making sure their contracts and handbook was tailored to their organisation realised that they didn't, for example, have a variation clause in their contract, etc. So really important that that is in place. Again, updating your staff handbook in relation to ensuring that it reflects COVID, etc. Again, really important. So there's lots of homework and groundwork we can be doing so that if we're offering new employees jobs or we're re-onboarding people back, we've these policies done now. Annual leave is an issue for many where people wouldn't have taken annual leave that they've accrued at this stage. So doing an assessment to see what is the current balance people have and how are you going to plan for that. Again, managing absence, any protected leave that you may have, other leave management you may need to consider. Have you done a HR matrix so that you can, get an idea of where everybody's at in terms of compliance, etc.? Mandatory training compliance, is that done? Is it up to date? What do we need to do as people come back? What about young persons? Is there disciplinary or grievances that are either on pause or ongoing? Obviously, that shouldn't be the case to have them on pause on the basis that we should be actively ensuring that we address those matters on a timely manner. And then your return to work, COVID safely protocols and training. So this is just a flavour of some of the areas that you could look at when you look at risk and compliance. I could keep adding to that list and talk to you about that for the entire session, other things like breaks management, etc. So there's lots of opportunity to look at that now and proactively put it in place. I suppose this quote is one of the most famous in terms of feedback, and the key thing is people really need feedback, and if they're not getting feedback, the best case scenario is they're staying where they were, but most likely they're going backwards if they're not getting feedback. So do we need to upskill our managers in relation to giving feedback and doing that really proactively? And remember, in our organisation, the managers are the people who are tasked with maximising productivity, ensuring retention, ensuring engagement, ensuring the culture cascades down. And oftentimes we don't give enough time and attention to ensuring our managers are well trained. So when we look at, I suppose, other priorities that you're going to look at, one of the key ones is in relation to performance management. So have we a good structure in place around managing probation, for example? One of the challenges is a lot of staff we recruited this time last year have now potentially, in terms of probation, expired. So again, it's important we ensure that we've communicated to staff that probation is paused. However, the start date means that they still go over 1 year. Again, if we have a good probation process in place, it's one of the most important things, and oftentimes is one that's overlooked. And next thing you know, the probation has been passed and we haven't really assessed the employee. Again, yearly performance management is only a snapshot. There should be no surprises. It's a check-in once a year. What's most important is that on-the-job performance and mentoring. It's a really good opportunity that you would do that annual performance review now, as people are starting to return, so that they're coming back with really good clarity. You know, they've got the training, etc., so that they're clear on what's expected of them. So that on-the-job performance mentoring becomes easier because people are clear what's expected of them. Handling feedback, the importance of praise in public and constructive feedback in private, and succession planning. Have we noticed some stars in relation to the performance of people that we need to look at? So I'm going to hand you back to Amanda, who's going to do one of our other polls.
Thanks, Caroline. So just our second poll now is just to check in with people if you have at this stage completed a training needs analysis for those complements you expect to return to work. Where are you at with that? Have you started? Yes, no, or in progress on that? And I suppose one thing that struck me just in terms of the whole area of performance management, Caroline, that I might just ask you a little bit about. I mean, is it fair to say that performance management has probably been much more challenging in the last year, given that, you know, staff have been, you know, in work, out of work, stop, start system, you know, some working part-time, some remote working. What's your thoughts on that in terms of the challenges and how to manage that?
Yeah, absolutely, Amanda. I think it's really difficult. And as well, I think the fact that people have so many other challenges outside of work, that's made work all the more challenging and more challenging for us to objectively assess the performance. But I suppose one of the things we always say is psychic management doesn't work. So the importance of naming it and having the conversation with the person if there are issues at that time. And if it's a serious issue, obviously, you know, doing it more formally, but at least if you have the conversation early, it's a definite nip it in the bud type approach that's really important.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And actually, I suppose just to support you on that, some of our free online programs with Flow Hospitality actually cover some really good tips and advice and tools there for, you know, maybe supervisors and managers that are just stepping up now to the plate to really have to do this a lot more. So it will be worthwhile maybe, you know, for staff that you have on part-time to actually maybe engage with those supports now and familiarize themselves with that until you can get back into doing face-to-face training there. So Colette, can we take the results of that second poll there, please? Okay, so great to see that, you know, we've over 50% between those in progress and has done the staff complement, but interesting to see there's still a good cohort of businesses involved with us here on the webinar that still have to actually look at doing that. And I suppose just on that point, Caroline, you know, I suppose it is possible that maybe some people haven't started that yet because they're not sure who's coming back. But you had pointed to the fact that they need to start that conversation now with businesses or with employees in terms of understanding the employee's intention to return, assuming that the workplace has a place for them to return.
Absolutely. And I suppose if they are your employees, we have to presume that we expect they're going to return, unless we follow one of the protocols we're going to cover in the second half of our session today. Without doubt, I think now is the time to be engaging and to do a check-in with staff. And the best way of doing it, I feel, is to get each manager to do a visual check-in with their team members themselves, to do a chat to say, hi Amanda, I'm just checking in. First of all, how's everything going? How are things? And just checking in to see if you're going to be coming back to us, because we're putting in place really exciting plans to upskill you, we want to make sure that we engage with you, etc. And even though staff, might feel, well, I'm out now at the minute, and, many staff are now saying, I'm biting the bit to get back, so, and if they've gone to another industry, for a lot of people, they're in hospitality and they absolutely love it. So again, it's, they want to come back. So, but I would be absolutely, because if you have to do recruitment is a really slow burn, and recruitment, by the time you have your recruitment strategy in place, by the time you know the skills you need, by the time you advertise, interview, etc., that will all take time. So I would definitely be prioritizing that engagement with staff now.
Absolutely. And Caroline, to that very point, I mean, I'm very conscious that some of my friends in institutes of technologies and colleges, there's businesses already approaching them now about their graduate recruits and their student recruits for summer work. So it really is important, as you say, to kind of get a sense of that and really to be able to map your recruitment plan now and start moving on it. It doesn't matter that we don't have a definitive date. I think all that work needs to be done now. So, okay, back over to you, Caroline. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. And I think just following on from Amanda's point, like the important thing for you at this stage is to start with, where are we now? And if you start with that skills gap analysis to say, okay, look, this is what we expect. And I appreciate how difficult it is when you don't have definitivity in terms of the roadmap ahead. But we're hoping now in the next announcement in April that will come. But start with, where are we now? Consider what are the future of work trends in terms of what we will need in relation to that. Determine what key skills are needed for the future of your departments and your business. Like, we're finding that there's a huge need for more people to work on the digital side of the business. Again, there's a lot of different new type of roles, like concierge type roles that are now being sought to assist with COVID, etc. So again, think about what you need, measure the current skills, find out what the gaps are, and put your findings into action, because you definitely, most organisations are likely to need to build a recruitment plan. And the starting where we are now is the piece I've covered off with Amanda, which is doing those individual chats with people. And the sooner you do that, the better. I suppose once you do that, then you'll have your, strategic workforce planning plan in place to give you an overview of the entire business, because ultimately for some departments you might be able to move people and upskill people by doing those one-to-one chats with people. They might be telling you, well, Caroline, I work in accommodation at the moment, but I'd actually much prefer to work in a different area, or vice versa. I work in banqueting and I'd love to work in accommodation. So by now doing those individual chats, it'll really help you get a very good strategic workforce planning plan in place to give you an entire overview of the full business, to get ahead of your competition, because otherwise everybody's going to be recruiting at the same time. And obviously increased productivity if you put people into the roles they're going to be happiest with, if that opportunity presents itself. And again, you're putting in place a long-term recruitment strategy also. So I suppose these are just to give you some ideas of different types of training that you may need to consider. The basics around COVID reinduction, manual handling, responsible service of alcohol. For supervisors, you might be doing time management, managing stress in the work environment, how to manage performance. And then there might be technical skills. For example, they might be upskilling, they might be digital sales, etc. So identify what it is you need, and then you can move forward by seeing, okay, what internal training can we provide, because you might have that skill or expertise. Consider the opportunities for Fall to Ireland. As Amanda mentioned, there's training available. I know there's lots of other forums as well that might be in a position to assist in terms of training. Consider developing employee mentorship programs and the transfer of knowledge and skills. Like, I'm a huge fan of putting in place active mentoring or active buddying systems to assist in that regard. Have employees consider, there might be industry specific webinars or training, etc. You might consider internships apprenticeships. As Amanda said, I would definitely be reaching out sooner rather than later to the local institutes, ETBs, etc. Put in place skills assessments to use in your recruitment process, so you know exactly what you need. Hire contingent workers that you may need so that you have them as a reserve, particularly potentially summer workers, and adapt your hiring process to take advantage of that. So obviously now we're doing all our interviews via Zoom because it makes more logical sense if it, especially in level 5. But for senior positions, you might be doing a walk and talk, coffee, you know, prior to them finally being offered the job, maintaining your social distancing, etc. But waiting until we come out of level 5, for most businesses, it'll be too late at that stage. So again, you're just thinking, what do we need to do? So when you're executing your recruitment plan, be clear on what you need, scope out the new roles, because the worst thing you can do is put up a generic job title, for example, like a concierge, and the person applying thinks it's something that it's not, and you think it's something different. Be cautious of full-time and part-time. You know, make sure that you're clear in relation to setting expectations, draft role profiles, consider backfilling existing roles, consider where you're going to recruit from and your attraction strategy. So are you going to go to the colleges? Are you going to consider abroad? What issues does that present in relation to travel, quarantine, etc.? What's your application process going to look like? Screening. And again, for me, I would always suggest that you do an initial screening to help reduce down the amount of people you're going to be interviewing. And for me, then, skills assessments are really helpful as well in that interview process, depending on the role. And make sure you always reference check people. I'm always amazed how many people don't get reference checked. And, you know, oftentimes that's when people are bringing me in to say they need to do a disciplinary, and we find out they weren't reference checked, and there might have been an issue, for example, with theft or dishonesty in their previous employment, and the same applies to you. So always do your recruitment, your interviewing strategy. As we always say, you know, recruit slow so that you don't recruit problems. So you're trying to make sure that people, as they join, they're the right fit for your organization. So change management has been something that, you know, lots of organizations have had to look at. And, you know, I suppose I'm only going to touch on some of those today due to time constraints. But remember, if you're making a change to somebody's terms and conditions, it's something you really need to tread carefully with. So staff retention and that management strategy is an obvious concern for those that are leaving not alone your business, but also leaving your industry. So again, doing those one-to-one chats, and even if somebody says to you, well, look, I'm working in a different industry now, I think I'm happy, I would say, look, any chance you'd still give me the 15-minute, you know, session, because you need to chat to them about what are their main drivers, because you're also going to learn from it. Because leaving your business and leaving the industry, we need to understand what you can do in relation to that. I suppose that's why it's really important that you look at what is your engagement and retention strategy. People join organizations, they generally leave managers, and you saw that quote in relation to the lack of feedback. It's a really big issue. So again, what's your communication plan? What are you doing to show that you're actively training and upskilling and re-engaging these people? What are you doing in relation to well-being? We know that some hospitality businesses are doing amazing things in relation to yoga and cookery demonstrations and, you know, different health classes, etc. But at minimum, you should be doing the monthly State of the Nation address, or town hall as we call it, which is giving people an update in relation to what does the plan to return look like. And even if you don't have certainty, you're letting people know what you are doing actively at the moment and keeping them up to date. So employer branding is really important and has never been more important at the moment, because again, what we don't want is for people to leave your not alone organization, but also leave the industry. So what employer branding really is what employees describe as your reputation as a place to work. and that general, I suppose, proposition. So in general, if I ask you, so what's it like to work in your business, what would people say? And if they say, God, look, it's a fantastic place to work, only for COVID, I'd be delighted to be back there in a flash, then your employer branding and culture is in a really healthy place. And it's really important to take a temperature check in relation to that, because again, Ireland is such a small place. If people are saying, well, listen, I wouldn't work there, you're not looked after, you're not valued, you're not communicated, well, then obviously you've got a really big concern. And we know that when people are making a decision to apply for a job, 84% say that the reputation of the company is really important. And we know that they're going to ask their family, friends, etc., because most people know somebody that has worked there already. 9 out of 10 candidates would apply for a job from an employer whose brand is actively maintained as a positive one. And 50% say they wouldn't work for a company with a bad reputation, even if they got a pay increase. So again, it shows you how big a deal that brand is and how important it is for you to look and assess what's my culture like right now. So when you're assessing your employer branding and your culture, and again, it's a good time to assess now, are we doing the right things and have we the right things in place? So staff benefits, staff supports like the employee assistance program, career progression opportunities, I think is crucial, and showing people that there's a pathway to progression and heroing examples within your organisation. I'm lucky enough to judge the IHF Employee of the Year awards for many of the counties each year. And in doing so, I'm always fascinated by how people show they progressed within the hospitality and tourism industry. And again, I think we should put the spotlight and hero that more so people see the career path, see the wage opportunity in terms of progression, etc. The other things that you've seen there, I suppose, are all about what we can put in place to support that culture and that employer branding. So all things to consider. So as we come to the concluding slide, and I'm going to be passing you back to Amanda then, the key takeaways from today's session that I would really actively encourage you to do, and the more of your team you involve in doing this, the better. And the great thing about Fáilte Ireland's webinar today is hopefully you found it helpful, but you could, use this as a session that you can go through with your team. So things like the starting point for me is define what the future of your organisation is going to look like. What is it that you need in terms of what you want to achieve in relation to your business overall strategy for your organisation, and then for the department specifically. What does that look like in terms of capabilities, in terms of skill, in terms of recruitment, etc. Once you've determined that business strategy, how are you going to fill the gaps? How are we going to retain what we have? How are we going to attract? How are we going to reward? How are we going to engage? And how are we going to grow the people that are with us currently? Then how are we going to look at driving performance? So we looked at things like enhancing your engagement, enhancing your HR processes, looking at communication, technology, and your metrics of measuring how are we going to do that well. And finally, we spoke about the importance of aligning the business vision to your organisation, vision, market, etc., so that you're fitter for purpose as a result of looking at external trends, looking at market disruption, and looking at your overall business strategy. And you're bringing your team on that journey with you to ensure they feel like that you are valuing them, you're upskilling them, etc. In today's presentation, we've done a whistle-stop tour to give you some food for thought to help you build your HR strategy. Hopefully it's been of help to you, and definitely a good starting point to get you on the road to doing that. So I'm going to hand you back to Amanda, and thank you all for your time and attention.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's clear to see that there is a lot of work to be done there. And I don't envy, having previously, in a previous life, worked as a HR manager in a hotel. I don't envy the job now in front of the teams. But I think what you've called out there really is that this is not just a job for HR. This actually has to involve the whole management team in terms of that, needs assessment, in terms of that structure, and even in terms of calling out that skills gap analysis is really a kind of you're facilitating that to be done really across the management team. I think it's fair to say, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Can I just have, there's a question in here, just, is there a template that you would recommend for skills gap analysis, Caroline? And maybe that's something we can chat to you after about and maybe include with the presentation as a suggestion to people.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about your skills matrix is in many ways, it has to be in keeping with what is your business strategy. So there's not one size fits all. So if you're a hotel that has a 5-star offering, you're going to have a different matrix to a restaurant or even to a hotel that has different service levels and offering. So I think the best starting point is to engage your own team. And, you can always get a little bit of coaching and support in terms of, pulling it together. But I do think you need to start with what is it that's relevant to our business rather than starting with necessarily the end in mind, because I think by doing that, you might miss a lot of really good stuff.
Yeah, and I suppose there's probably really good insights from the team and the supervisors and managers as well as to kind of the areas that they may have struggled with after reopening last year, but just, obviously they were in the throes of operations and time didn't allow for that reflection. So there probably is some really valuable insights to look at from there.
Absolutely, well said.
Okay, so another question then that's come in from Kieran is, just can you explain what is a variation clause? Can you elaborate on that, please, a little bit in terms of contracts?
Absolutely. So a variation clause in the contract is basically a clause that basically allows the employer to vary somebody's terms and conditions by giving them notice in writing normally and giving them a specific timeline to do so. If you don't have that variation clause, it means you can't then change somebody's terms and conditions without their agreement. This needs to be included in the contract when it's given to the employee at the start of their employment, because if you introduce it now, obviously you can introduce any new terms once the employee accepts them. But to insist that they accept it now wouldn't be fair and reasonable because of the fact it's such an important clause in a contract. So I'll give you an example. So if you have a variation clause, for example, you could say, well, Caroline, you've always worked Monday to Friday. I need to vary your hours now because the variation clause allows it, that I need you to work, different hours, different days. Also, it may be in relation to pay reduction, different things like that. So it's a really important clause, but one that needs to be drafted correctly and implemented correctly.
Okay, and I suppose, Caroline, is it fair to say then that if you're negotiating the introduction of a variation clause now, because of the structural changes, that you probably need to ensure that you're doing that fairly across the organisation, and you've got to watch the selectivity risks around that?
You do, and I would say I would probably not even get into a variation clause right now if you don't have it. I would start putting it in place in your new contracts going forward, because if you go retrospectively back and say, look, Amanda, you're here 5 years now and I want to include this clause, it possibly will create a lot of distrust, because you're better off sitting down negotiating with the employee now in relation to whatever changes you would make, would be my best advice.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. And then just a really good question actually here from Deirdre is, would you recommend outside resource in terms of somebody like a recruitment agency to help you draft role profiles, or should this ideally be done internally? And I'd probably particularly like to call out here is, like I spoke about at the start there, the move and the demand on a lot of businesses now to upskill and add new skills into the organisation, particularly around, for example, in-house digital capability. So I'm conscious that there might be some roles now required of businesses that, the owner may have no past experience of in terms of ever having to push that role profile together. What's your advice there?
I would say your best bet is to engage a HR consultancy or a HR advisory consultancy to assist with that, because they're going to take what it is that you're saying you vaguely need. So use that example. So say you vaguely need that, they will help you scope it out, they will help you draft the role profiles. A recruitment agency's job is to fill the role you tell them you have. And if you go to an agency, potentially they will give you the candidates they have on their books, which mightn't be exactly what you want. And I always think it's really important that you, in any job ad, in any role profile, etc., that you clearly scope out what it is you need. And that applies if somebody resigns, if you have a new vacancy, etc., because what you've had before may have got you here, but it won't get you there. So you need to constantly use that opportunity as an opportunity to reassess, okay, what is it that the business needs right now? So without doubt, it's a HR consultant, a HR expert that you should get to assist you with something like that.
Okay, thank you. And then just another question here, back to the variation clause. Could the variation clause be found to be an attempt to circumvent, sorry, I'm just trying to see the rest of the question there, to circumvent normal contractual relationships?
I think we've kind of answered that in the previous question, which for me, like, the employment relationship is built on trust. And most of the time, you know, we need to be able to trust the employee, and the employer needs to be able to be trusted as well. And most of the time, if we did something like that, i.e., you know, forcing a variation clause in if we don't have it, to me that would breach trust, unless it was very carefully managed. And even at that, I think it would be very difficult to achieve. And as you said at the start, I'm doing this for a very long time at this stage.
Okay.
And for me, I always think, as much as possible, if you do things collaboratively, if you engage with people, if you consult with people, most people will see the business case. And like, I would always, rather than saying, I need you to change your hours or whatever it is, I would always say the business requires, because you're making it that bit more objective. And I think for me, I would always try and go with, look, this is where we're at the minute. We really need you to cooperate because, and, you know, based on that, we look and see what are the options available to us. And we will have covered in previous sessions, Amanda, the whole concept of short time. We'd have covered layoff, and we've covered redundancy. I mean, ultimately, you know, for most employees, again, handling those in line with the contractual obligations is really important. So the variation should be, you know, it's really important though to put it in place for all new employees starting, because it does give the employer a lot of options if they need to rely on them, especially in an emergency situation like COVID has been for many.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And just a question here then is, if a contract hasn't been updated in 20 years for an employee, but there's terms and conditions in it, can they now be enforced if they haven't been done to date? For example, somebody that was brought in on a contract with you know, a responsibility to work 5 over 7 days, but to date the employee has only tended to work Monday to Friday. What's your thought on that?
So unfortunately, custom and practice for 20 years has meant that the Monday to Friday is the person's hours. If you have a variation clause, that's where it comes in, where you can now sit down and say, look, Caroline, when we started out, you know, we said we may need to vary, but again, you need to be conscious of what are the risks here. And that's why we started when we spoke about the first thing to do when you're looking at your HR strategy is that risk assessment. Ultimately, that person may say, look, I was constructively dismissed. I felt I had no option but to leave the employer because after 20 years, they're changing my hours. So instead, I would start from the position of, Johnny, the business requires you to work this many days. This will require a change. These are the options that we can give you around that, and start a consultation and engagement process with the person. Ultimately, sometimes we have to enforce a variation, you know, because the business really does require it. But with somebody with 20 years service, I would tread very carefully. And that's the challenging thing about HR and employment law. There's always an answer to your question because the legislation is very good at guiding us. But we also have to balance the legislation with the morale, with the doing the right thing, with the implication for everybody else, you know, in the organisation, etc.
Yeah, and I suppose I think it's just timely now to call out, you know, a lot of what Caroline's been talking about here in terms of contracts and clauses and, you know, layoffs and redundancies, that material still exists on our COVID Hub website. So I would encourage you all to visit the COVID Hub website, and under business support, select the drop down for HR, and you'll see all those guidance and materials that are still relevant there. Finally, one other question, well, two other questions, Caroline. Have you any recommendations on a reference template, or would you suggest one, or?
I suppose my advice always with references are, when you're giving them, tread carefully, because remember, from a GDPR point of view, that information is being recorded. So for example, if you say, well, look, they weren't great and their attendance wasn't great and they weren't great, and then the person can actually request a copy of that from the new employer they've gone for the job with. So tread carefully when giving them. When getting them, I would ask everything, including the kitchen sink. And, you know, we live in Ireland, so generally people know people who know people, you know, to get a really good detailed reference. And remember, in a reference, it's not alone what's said, it's what's not said.
What's not said, yeah.
And some organisations have a policy that they just give a statement of terms and say, Caroline, we worked here as this job title and these dates. But what I would emphasise is, not doing references to me is a mortal sin in HR. Because again, don't recruit problems into the organisation. And again, think about doing OPQs to complement your recruitment process, because some people can be really good at interviews, and like, you know, different people would ask me to help prep them for an interview and stuff like that. The difference before and after is stark. So again, just don't rely on interviews solely, because your people are your most valuable asset, no two ways about it, in hospitality. And we all know that from the brilliant experience that we all receive when we visit each other's properties. But that's down to recruiting the right people, because if you don't recruit the right people, it's way more difficult to train, develop, coach, mentor, and maximise people's performance.
And I know, Caroline, you said, you know, ask everything, including the kitchen sink. I think we've got to be careful there that we're asking stuff that's legally allowed, you know what I mean? And the same has been asked for everybody. But if you were to kind of highlight, you know, maybe 4 or 5 things in a reference that you would say are a must to capture or to seek out, what would you say they are?
I would say one key one is, would you re-employ Caroline again? Okay. I would ask, what did you find Caroline's key area for development?
Okay.
I would ask, what would you say during Caroline's employment was the area that she needed to improve on the most, in terms of what was her technical skill like, so the technical ability to do the job. And I would ask, what was her personality fit in line with your culture? So, because to me, most of the time, people can technically do the job, no problem, but it's the cultural fit, being a team player, you know, displaying the core values, customer service, etc. And then I would always ask at the very end, is there anything else you'd like to tell me to ensure that I make the right hiring decision, because this role is crucial to the organisation.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And one final question, Caroline, we're just coming up to an hour. Are staff entitled to holidays for the past year, or were they paused? And I think we covered that in previous webinars, because while they're out on PUP, everything is paused. They're only covered for holidays for the time that they're at work. Is that
absolutely spot on, Amanda? You've been listening and learning and building on all your HR knowledge as we've gone along through the journey.
Well, so I'm a long time out of it now, but it's great keeping it fresh with you. So Colette, if we could just go back to the slides, I just want to formally close out the session today and to thank everybody for staying with us throughout. So just to summarize, I suppose, from today, you know, to look at, and I think, you know, this saying is one that actually somebody said to me last week when we were in conversation with all of those business managers when we were closing out the strategic management program with IMI and Fáilte Ireland. If you want to predict the future, you must lead the creation of the future. And I think that's really a very good, I suppose, motto and motto for HR, because in actual fact, I know that, there's still a lot of unknowns, but there really is clear evidence from Caroline's work today that there is a lot that can be done. There is a lot that we know that we need to do now. So just to kind of highlight the ones that I've really called out here, is really, which has kind of stuck with me from Caroline's presentation, is just assessing those department structures and role requirements now, and involving the wider management team as part of that. Completing the skills audit and the training needs analysis on the back of that for existing staff, but also then for areas like, that compliance training, that COVID protocols return to COVID safety protocol return to work training, and other technical and developmental training that's there as well. And again, your management team needs to be a key part of that. Drafting the recruitment and onboarding plan, and as Caroline said, we can't do that quick enough, because we really need to start to look now at where our sources of skilled labour supply are, and then also starting to prepare and work through those individual meetings and group communications with staff around the organisational restructuring needs. So people have better clarity as to what's coming down the line with them, and what the revised business structure is going to look like, and what the revised HR requirements will be in accordance with that. So the last thing, it just leaves me to thank you so much for your time today, and to just say to you, we will be sending you a copy of the recording from today, and to thank Caroline for joining us, for the expertise as always. To my colleagues Brendan and Rosaline for fielding me through your questions today, thank you. And to Colette, as always, for the technology and keeping us on. Thank you very much. If any of you would like to look at, in sharing with us into the chat what three things or one action that you'd really now focus on as a result of today, we'd be happy to kind of take that on board as well. But just to say thank you, hope you have a good afternoon. Slán agus Banach.
Thank you.